First of all, I want to say I'm very happy to be here. I want to thank the department, the Casa Italiana and Centro Primo Levi for the hospitality and for the wonderful organization. I will try to briefly describe the contents of this research, which was just recently translated in English, as Natalia said, and which was basically a work in which I was a research that has been developed since the second half of the 90s. The Italian original edition was published in 2004. This English edition is a slightly revised version, taking into account new bibliography, some new documents, but basically the structure of the book remains the same. I think that the best thing to start from is how the research started, what were the key problems that I was trying to address. It was 1995 when my tutor then, Adrian Littleton, with whom I had several fruitful discussions, suggested that in that moment when, as Natalia remembered, new historiography was developing in Italy, new debate concerning fascist anti-Semitism, racial persecution, etc., it was time to study the effects, the long-term effects of those policies. The obvious assumption being that you do not understand the impact of persecution if you simply stop at what happened between 1938 and 1945. You have to see what happened in the post-war years to see the long-lasting echoes of such policies. The second and more interesting and more relevant issue was that since the early 90s, a whole set of contributions, and the key one was by an Italian scholar named David Bidussa, raised the issue of what is called the myth of the good Italian. The issue being that for a long time Italian culture, politics, and historiography as well, but not only Italian, even foreign discourse concerning fascist Italy had concentrated on the image of the good Italian, in opposition, in contrast to the evil, the bad German, of course. What Bidussa and others put under scrutiny was the sense, the social function of such a narration, and what they started to do was to deconstruct it, to show how such a representation was not at all capable of introducing us to a full understanding of the events. Now, assuming that starting point, assuming that for a long time, since the post-war until the early 90s, historiography in cultural debate in Italy and abroad had misrepresented the role, the image of the fascist regime, its occupation policies, its racial policies, and so on and so forth. One question emerges, which is a key question, is why? Why did these representations take place? What was their role, their function, and why in the early 90s did they start being put under a new light and being reconsidered, and in many cases overturned radically by new research. So the aim of the research was in particular to illustrate one aspect of this issue that concerned, of course, racial persecutions. The issue being that you couldn't have had development of the so-called myth of the good Italian without the complicity, without the collaboration, cooperation of the Italian Jews themselves. And you have a whole series of statements by intellectuals, community leaders, rabbis, and so on and so forth during the post-war years until the late 80s who support an interpretation of fascist anti-Semitism, which tends to deny its gravity, tends to stress how Italians did not truly implement the racial policies, how later, after the German occupation in 1943, they did all they could to save persecuted Jews. So one of the goals of this research was to illustrate how the persecuted themselves, the hair of the persecuted the Italian Jews, contributed to the development of the myth of the good Italian, and why. In this respect, the research was meant, and that was also what I tried to do in the following years, to contribute to the deconstruction of the reconstruction and the deconstruction of things in many ways go together, but of the post-war myths and cultural representations which have been at the foundations of the Italian cultural, political, and social system since 1945, what we can call the anti-fascist narrative. How to tackle this problem and what sources, through what point of view. The first thing that was clear to me that I thought was fundamental is that to understand why certain memories were promoted by and legitimated by Italian Jewry, it was necessary to understand what was Italian Jewry after 1945. So the first half of the book and the research concentrates on the reconstruction of Jewish life, the rebuilding of communities, the new leadership that arises, as well as, in general, the whole issue of social, economic, cultural, and political reintegration into the country. So now I will start briefly summarizing the key points of this part, which I think is a premise of any reflection on memory. You cannot understand the social function and the development of certain cultural representations if you don't know what was the context in which they developed. Now, the first thing to start from is that Italian fascist racial persecutions, of course, was divided into two phases, which reflect the evolution of the war and of the history of the fascist regime. First phase, between 1938 and 1943, is a phase in which the fascist regime is fully autonomous and introduces its own specific, peculiar kind of anti-Semitic policies in the country and in the territories occupied elsewhere. Yugoslavia, Greece, southern France in particular, but also Libya, and so on. Then you have a second phase, which is a very different phase between 1943 and 1945, when you have the fall of Mussolini in 25 of July 1943, then his liberation from the Germans, the occupation of northern Italy by Centro and Northern Italy by the German military, with the collaboration of Mussolini's newly created Italian Social Republic. While in the south, of course, you have the Allied armies which slowly march up and liberate the peninsula since the summer of 43. In this second phase, you have a completely different situation. As historian Michele Sarfatti describes it, in the first phase you have a persecution that deprives Jews of their civil, economic rights. In the second phase, what is under attack is life itself. And this second phase is marked by German occupation, by the direct activity of German forces in the deportation of Jews to extermination camps in the east, as well as some smaller but not irrelevant isolated massacres that took place in the peninsula itself. And during this second phase, you have the active, very determined collaboration by Mussolini's Social Republic in the roundups and in taking persecution to another level. But you also have another thing that develops. You have the resistance. And that's a key element to understand how things were perceived afterwards. Between 1943 and 1945, in Italy, we have, as historian Claudio Pavone clearly illustrated, a true civil war. We have the conflict between the Allies and the Germans, but we have a civil war between different factions of Italians, the fascist and the anti-fascist coalition. Now, in that context, protecting Jews, saving Jews from deportation, from arrest, became an element that was logical and coherent with the activity of partisan and anti-fascist groups. And in many instances, we have acts by the local population that protected, hid, and saved lives of Jews. These facts had a strong impact on the Jews that were saved, of course, but in general the perception of the whole issue, and in several instances totally changed the perception of the earlier phase. Trying to make it, to explain it in a different way, it's as if the acts of courage and humanity of the second phase had obliterated the indifference and the complicity in persecution in the first phase. Maybe we'll get later during the discussion into more detailed analysis of what happens and why so many Italian Jews were hidden, protected, and saved. I just want to remember, though, that we can say clearly that all those about 8,000 Jews, Italian Jews or Jews in Italian occupied territories who were deported and to extermination camps, were arrested and well, at least in 50% of the cases we have a clear indication of who did the arrest, and it's clear that in half of this, in half of the half about which we know who performed the arrest, it was Italian authorities directly involved, Carabinieri or various authorities of the Italian Social Republic. We also know that, and we can clearly say that all those who were deported because someone suggested to the authorities their presence, sold them out to the persecutor, as well as what?
5,000 lira.
Yes, as well as, of course, all those who survived were saved because someone, often more than one, helped them. Having said this, when the first phase ends in 1943 and Mussolini falls and the new Badoglio government takes over in Rome for actually a very brief amount of time, for 45 days, he does not cancel the racial laws. He asks informally to a Jesuit, a key figure that was a connection, an unofficial connection between the Italian government and the Vatican, what the Church thought about the racial policies, and the answer was there are some good things and some bad things. Basically, nothing was done to change the persecution policies in July 1943 after Mussolini fell. Things changed later after the armistice signed with the Allies. The big input to abrogate the racial laws and give back the Jews their rights, their properties, and so on and so forth came from the Allies. There's a specific article of the armistice signed in Malta, two versions, a long version, which says that the Italians will have to do that, will have to cancel the racial legislation. So this is the first element, and the process of abrogation of the racial laws was a very slow one. It started in 1943, but it actually was completed only in late 1947. There were very, very many steps, and of course these steps came to be, at least in the first part, in a situation in which there was a war going on and deportations going on in the north. What you have in what is, I think, a key element to understand how the post-war situation develops is that, as I said before, we usually think as 1943 to 1945, and rightly so, as a period of heavy persecution, life-threatening persecution, which is true for a section of the country. For another section of the country, that was the beginning of liberation. There was a liberated Italy that was free and starting to develop political, cultural activity before the end of the war. There was the southern part, through which the Allies were coming through. And there in the south was a conspicuous number, especially of foreign Jews, which had been placed in internment camps in Calabria, in Campania, and mainly in the southern regions. You have several thousands of them. They are liberated much earlier than all the rest, and they and then the Roman Jews, which are liberated in June 1944, start living a new life without the threat of deportation in a totally different context, while at the same time in the north a completely different the war is raging on. And in this new life that they start living, a key role is played by foreign Jewish representatives. The Jewish Brigade inside the British Army, American Jewish chaplains inside the US Army, and since early 1944, the American Joint Distribution Committee, which play a key role in the rebirth of Jewish life in southern Italy, which helped the reorganization of community life, of schools, and which give all of this community life a completely new imprint. Especially the soldiers of the Jewish Brigade, which came from Palestine and had an obvious pro-Zionist stance, did very active propaganda activity. Later on, not only propaganda, but also more concrete action to promote illegal immigration into Palestine. And this represents a dramatic shift. We have a community that had been largely anti-Zionist or indifferent to Zionism until then, which suddenly is living through not only the trauma of persecution, which certainly leads them to consider the Zionist option in a different way, but also to new cultural and political input. And in this context, you clearly see how the events of the war and of the immediate post-liberation period were lived in very different ways by different generational groups. And in particular, you have a clear cleavage, a difference, a separation between those that were adolescents around 1938 and those that were already adults or well established in their adult life. The second group mainly wished to start back, to go back to the situation as it was before. The first group did not have a normal adult life to go back to. Their lives had been disrupted in a key moment of development and growth, and they were the ones who were targeted the most by Zionist propaganda. One of the key things that the Jewish Brigade did, for example in Rome, was to reopen Jewish schools. And the Jewish school in Rome was actually the first school to reopen in all of Rome in July 1944. And these Jewish schools were completely different from the Jewish schools you had before. After 1938, you had the creation of a whole set of Jewish educational institutions, basically because Jews were kicked out of the national education system at all levels. So the Jewish communities had to create, from one day to the next, somehow improvise schools for these children. But these were not Jewish schools. These were schools for Jews, which is a different thing. What was created, especially in Rome and after the liberation of the rest of the country, was a model that was developed again in other communities in the north, was a system of Jewish education in which they would teach them Hebrew, they would push them towards the going back to the religious tradition, and they would teach them the history of Zionism. They would prepare translations of key texts by fundamental Zionist thinkers from the 19th century and beyond, and they would explain them the geography of Palestine and so on and so forth. What we see here is, well, something that happened not only in Italy, but in general in the Western world. After the end of the war, the attitude of Jewish communities toward the Zionist cause was much different, as we know, from what it was before. Before, Zionists were minority groups. Afterwards, Zionism had majority support. This does not mean that most of the people wanted to emigrate necessarily, but the general climate was different. Now, this input from foreign Jewish groups, and especially the Jewish Brigade, had an influence in internal dialectics of the Italian Jewish community. Now, the leaders of the Italian Jewish community in 1943 and 44 were those that had been nominated during the fascist regime. They were figures who had been identified as suitable for their good relations with the regime, because they were fascists, being oversimplified, but basically they were fascists. And the process of defascistization of the country also impacted the Jewish community. What you have is that, for example, in Rome, the Allied military government says to the Jewish community, you cannot have these leaders. We do not accept you having these people still leading your local and national organizations, because they are fascists. And this was the only group, organized movement, that was active and capable of substituting that leadership. It was the Zionists. Italian Zionists had been a very, very small minority, largely marginalized in the earliest years. And in that situation, they were the only ones who had a cultural and political agenda that was still capable of responding to the needs of the moment. The fascists obviously did not have one, or the one they had was not applicable in any way. And so very rapidly, much more rapidly than what happened elsewhere in other European Jewish communities, since 1944, you have basically a Zionist group taking over Italian Jewish institutions. And what they did after liberation was to confirm the pro-Zionist education agenda that was brought about in Italy by the Palestinian soldiers of the Jewish Brigade. So they said, we want to keep the Jewish schools. Those schools for Jews created in a hurry in 1938, we want to keep them after the war. It was a debate. Why do we need them now? And they said, we need them because we want to change the schools for Jews in Jewish schools, and the schools became a key element for the cultural transformation of the community in a direction which was pro-Zionist and religiously orthodox at the same time. And they had, if we look at the development of the number of students who go there, they had a meaningful success. At least 1/3, sometimes a little more, in the first 15 years of the post-war, went to these Jewish schools. And together with these schools, you have the birth and development of a whole set of Jewish juvenile associations, movements, mainly Zionist movements, who pushed for immigration, to make Aliyah, to go to Palestine and then to Israel. At the same time, the interesting is that almost 2/3 of those who, the 1940s and then the 50s, left Italy, those young Italian Jews who left Italy for Palestine and then Israel, would return after a couple of years because life was too hard. And life was just too hard in Palestine. And at the same time, life was relatively easy compared to Palestine in Italy. Post-war Italy had huge problems, of course, social, economic, and yet reintegration was possible, even though the legislation was slow to recognize all rights, even though there were many limits in the reintegration policies, reintegration was relatively easy compared to many other situations around Europe. Especially easy within the private sector, much more difficult within the public sector. Military officers, employees in the public administrations, university professors, doctors in state hospitals, they had very big problems going back to their jobs. Basically because their jobs had been taken up by other people after 1938. And those people were not going to be picked out. So returning was very complicated, and even when they returned, they were perceived as a strange and disturbing figure. But in the private sector, in private business, commerce, in the professions, liberal professions, of course there was although the possibility to reintegrate very rapidly in the social and economic life of the country. Another factor that had a great impact for the construction of this context, in which I'd like to use a formula that is very clear by French philosopher Valentine Mitchell. He said that after the war we see, he thought about France, but it goes for Italy too, the triumph of Zionism over anti-Zionism inside the Jewish world, and at the same time the triumph of apathy over action. So we have all these people who are Zionists in theory, in their feelings, in their speeches, in their, but who basically do not move, don't put it into practice in any way. And this is perfect for Italy, and the key explanation is that it was very there were a whole set of possibilities to reintegrate happily within society. This was also made possible not only by the social, legislative, and economic factors, but also, I think, by key symbolic elements. The narrative that took place, and that was the founding narrative of the Italian Republic, was that it was an anti-fascist republic. It was born from the resistance. And fascism was perceived and represented by the most influential intellectuals and political parties as something that was not truly not a true expression of Italian culture, sentiment. Mussolini and a band of his followers had taken power, but those were not the true Italians. Now the true Italians had taken over, and everything was restored back as it was. One of the narratives was that of the resistance as the second Risorgimento, which fits perfectly with the symbolic needs of the Jewish population, for whom Risorgimento meant emancipation, and the second Risorgimento resistance coincided with the second emancipation. I just make an example. The historian and journalist Luigi Salvatorelli, an anti-fascist intellectual, in a pamphlet published in late 1943, said that fascism was the anti-Risorgimento. Fascism was the denial of Italian culture, tradition, and so on and so forth. Now, within that framework, it was very easy for Italian Jews to find their place and say, yes, it's true. Fascism was the denial of Italian rights and culture and traditions and so on and so forth, and racial persecutions were an aspect of that denial of the true national sentiment. So reintegration was possible inside the anti-fascist narrative, and inside this narrative, the idea that persecution was something that had no roots, no real background, that was not shared by the population, was a very powerful idea. It basically was another aspect of fascist policy, which, as the general discourse would make it, was not shared by most Italians. It fit perfectly into the national narrative. Not only it fit perfectly, but to some extent, that national narrative, that anti-fascist national narrative, needed the support of the Jewish groups, the Jewish intellectuals, the Jewish institutions to confirm the value and of that anti-fascist narrative, and they did, and you have a lot of declarations, especially in the early post-war years, of community leaders saying, yes, okay, we have problems with the reintegration legislation, it's slow, professors have difficulty getting back in their jobs, returning properties is complicated, but we trust the new government because we identify perfectly with them and their values. We know that this is the true Italy. Here there's never been anti-Semitism, so everything will go well in the end. They gave their contribution to the establishment of the anti-fascist narrative, and their key contribution was in the construction of the myth of the good Italian. You have a whole set of declarations saying basically, and also writings by key Italian Jewish intellectuals saying that the persecution was not born autonomously out of Italian culture and fascist ideology. There was either an imitation, some kind of reproduction of Nazi ideology, or it was imposed by Hitler and Mussolini. That was the first element. Then the second thing they would say is that it wasn't truly implemented. Yeah, they passed the laws, but Italians, they cannot implement normal laws. How could you think they could implement these special legislation? Furthermore, they certainly did not want to. And the third element that was fit into this narrative was that all those who spoke had been saved. They had actually been saved by Italians, which is true. And their personal gratitude, their personal experience also pushed them into expressing this kind of idea. This narrative, this myth of the good Italian, was, after all, perfectly in line with the psychological needs of the minority who wanted to reintegrate. If you want to reintegrate, the first, well, you have to say you like the place, you believe in the people, you fit into, and that's what they were saying. We're totally part of this. We do not believe that Italians wanted to persecute us. It's not true. They were basically denying a whole set of the things that had happened. If you look at the early memoirs, and there's a lot of them published between 1945 and 1948, they tell about a whole set of circumstances each individual went through. So they say about the friendly people and the unfriendly people they met, of course. But somehow it's always the friendly ones who represent the true spirit of the Italians. The unfriendly ones are always represented as marginal, not in any way the expression of the true Italian spirit. Now, this set of representations also had, and I'm going to conclude very quickly, a very relevant political implication. And the Italian Foreign Ministry noticed it very, very quickly. In 1944, in the summer of 44, after the liberation of Rome, some diplomats in the Italian Foreign Ministry noticed a declaration by a recently convened conference of Italian Zionist groups in central and southern Italy, parts that were liberated at that time. And the first statement made at that conference was, "We wish to thank the Italians for all they have done to us and the fact that they've proven that they have nothing to do with racism and anti-Semitism," and so on and so forth. And the diplomats at the Foreign Ministry said, "This is very interesting. This can perfectly serve our needs." They made copies of that declaration, they had it translated in a whole set of languages, and they sent it to embassies abroad, in the United States, in Great Britain, and so on. And that was the beginning of a diplomatic and cultural effort, which developed until basically until the peace treaties were signed in late 1947. What was the problem? Italian authorities had an interest in distinguishing Italian guilts and responsibilities from German ones. It was a key political element. They hoped to play this Jewish card at the peace conference. It was part of a whole set of other elements. One of the other elements was to insist on the role of the Italian resistance, the fact that the Italians had liberated themselves, so they could not be treated as enemies. They were allies. They were on the right side. The ones that had to be punished were Mussolini and a restricted number of his collaborators, but not the Italian people. That was the basic narrative from the first Bonomi government in June 44 and up to for several years, actually. And together with that, was this Jewish card. They could say that, well, the Jews themselves say we were not to blame. That was a very interesting element for Italian diplomacy. And you have a whole series of reports by the Foreign Ministry between 1944 and 1947 how to use Italian Jewish statements and declarations and so on and so forth. Behind it, it is very, very clear that they have this idea that the Jews are very powerful. The Jews have a great influence in Washington. So through the Jews we can improve our political and diplomatic condition. That is largely an illusion, and somehow testifies to the penetration of a whole series of stereotypes, but they acted upon it. So they organized a whole series of things. The Foreign Ministry itself published and translated it into French, English, Spanish volume in which they illustrated the role of the Foreign Ministry itself in the saving of Jews in occupied areas, Italian-occupied areas of Europe, Greece, Yugoslavia, southern France. In doing so, they presented real documents and real facts. People had been saved. What is not correct is the context in which it took place. In the preface of this volume, one of the earliest sentences right in the beginning says that what that volume demonstrates is that Mussolini gave orders and wanted to persecute the Jews. But those orders were never implemented by his own foreign ministry and by the military, which is a farcical representation of things. Davide Rodogno, in a book published a few years ago, Fascism's European Empire, has clearly shown how they worked towards the Duce to come implement his policies, not against him. It is You have a regime, and you cannot imagine that the military and the diplomats work against it all the time. Why did they promote this narrative, especially within the foreign ministry? For two reasons: the general diplomatic national interest and the personal interest of the diplomats involved. They had to save themselves from the defascistization process. And as Giacomo de Benedetti wrote, what is the best way to prove you're an anti-fascist? That you save some Jews. If you look at it's true, in the post-war trials of notorious fascists in Italy, the key thing that almost all of them say is that I saved Jews. I must not be condemned. General Goatta, who was responsible of atrocious massacres in Italian-occupied Yugoslavia, said, I saved Jews. Nicola Pende, one of the key figures of Italian racism, said, I protected and saved the Jewish family in Rome after 1943. That was a key element for their personal survival, as well as for as something that fit into a more general context that concerned state interest. Now, it is interesting to see how these the Italian Jewish needs to reintegrate and to tell themselves that Italians are good after all, and we can trust and the interest of the diplomats, military, and all the high figures in the Italian state on one side, and of personal interest, and the interest of the system, of the anti-fascist narrative, fit in perfectly to it. There is one final aspect, and I'll be very, very quick, I'm sorry, I'm speaking probably too much. Between 1945 and 1948, we have another issue concerning Jews that happens in Italy. We mentioned it a few days ago with the screening of the movie The Earth Cries Out right here at the Casa Italiana. We have several tens of thousands of displaced persons, of Jews who survived persecution in Eastern Europe, who move throughout the continent, arrive in Italy, and from there try to go to Palestine, illegally immigrating to Palestine and violating the British Navy. So Italy is a key passage point for obvious geographical reasons. And the Italian government, while officially saying, of course, they are not supporting this because it's illegal, unofficially was doing all it could to help this illegal movement of peoples. And by doing so, they encountered the gratitude and the appreciation of Italian Jewish Zionist institutions, but also foreign institutions. The World Jewish Congress in particular was very, very interested in the collaboration of Italian authorities in the whole Aliyah, in the whole illegal immigration process. And the two things, even though it would be simplistic and naive to think about a simple dog's death, we help you in your illegal immigration, and we allow the passage of these tens of thousands of refugees through Italy. In exchange, you give us a patent of good peoples that do not need to be punished in these treaties. This representation would be simplistic. Yet, at the end of 1946, the Italian government asks the Italian Jewish institutions to contact the World Jewish Congress and say this. Present in the paper, the documents you will present at the Paris Peace Conference, please state clearly that Italians have saved Jews, they do not need to be punished, actually they have to be thanked for what they did. And the document that was sent to Italian Jewish communities who had to send it to the World Jewish Congress also said, and remember our deal. Remember how we helped you in the earliest years, in the latest years. So what happened between 1945 and 1947 had an influence on the representation of what happened in earlier years. And the World Jewish Congress did so. If you look at the documents presented at the Paris Peace Conference, there is a section, not very long, on Italy, in which they basically endorse all the requests by the Italian authorities. Of course, this had no impact on how the peace treaty was written and implemented. Only in the minds of some Italian diplomats, the Jews had power to change the power balance in the peace treaties. Yet it is meaningful that all of this was put in motion. After 1947, after the signing of the peace treaties, the political need for the myth of the good Italian was not there anymore. But seeds had been planted. And especially inside and also outside, this image of the good Italian fit perfectly as a counter image to the evil German. And when I say seeds had been planted, there's a whole set of publications around Europe and in the United States. You have, for example, an article published in the New York Times, which is clearly a product of direct input from the Italian diplomatic agencies. At least they claim it is in the document, which says the title it was an article of June '46, and the title was "Fascist Rescue of Jews Revealed." This is just an example, or for another example, there was a whole series of articles published in Belgian press on a whole set of articles about the racial persecutions around Europe, and the section on Italy was fantastic because the journalist went to the embassy in Brussels and said, please give me documentation on what happened in Italy. And the embassy wrote to the foreign ministry and said, please send us reports from each single prefect stating clearly how we did not implement racial laws. And they did. And each prefect from each province went on to give this documentation on how they did all they could to ignore the legislation. And all that documentation was used. And once it was put in circulation, once it was obtained the legitimation from the victims themselves, it was very hard to look at things in a different way. Furthermore, this image of the good Italian is something that fit perfectly in a wider European-wide scheme of things. In an article published some years ago, Tony Judd wrote that, thinking about how European countries managed to cope with their responsibilities, how all of them tended to project the blame on Germany. The Germans were the only ones to blame, and the Italians were capable of building for themselves a special role. They were the anti-Germans, the exact opposite of that image. And so you have the creation of a symbolic system with the good and the bad, the Italians playing the good role, which strongly influenced memory politics and also history writing. One example of this, and I close. Léon Poliakov, which of course you all know, the great French historian, since his earliest writings, dedicated a lot of attention on how Italians acted towards Jews, especially in southern France. Now, he himself had been there, and so there was a personal dimension. But it's interesting that when he talks about how good the Italians were protecting the Jews in southern France, his aim, his true aim, is implicitly saying how bad the French, the Vichy French regime was. So the image of the good Italian becomes some ideal model on which to measure in opposition and in contrast to this the guilts and the faults of others. Like the evil German is the same thing on the other side of the spectrum. There's a whole set of other things, but I think I spoke too much. So.
Thank you, Guri. I think this was most interesting. I really encourage everybody to get the book and look at how
Can you speak a little
Yes,
louder?
sorry. I look at how practically this reintegration happened, because I think that the bureaucratic and institutional element also is very telling of the process. I will pass the chair to Susan Zuccotti, who will make comments and lead the conversation. I know that there are many scholars here whom I encourage to intervene and comment and participate in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, I would like to begin by thanking Professor Schwarz for a fascinating and incredibly articulate account of his work, written, spoken as if it were written, with phrases that were penetrating and clear and articulate, and we will remember. I hope today to throw the discussion back to you for the most part. I suspect that most of you have many questions, and we do have time. So I will make my own comments somewhat brief, but I thought a couple of things I might like to point out, and then I do have questions, as you do. When my book about the Italians and the Holocaust was first published in 1987, a whole generation ago, not much was known about what had happened in Italy during the Holocaust years, at least among average readers in this country. Not much had been written in Italy either at that point, although a bit had. I look back on my book now in the light of new historiography and new documents, and I'm not dissatisfied with what I wrote. I would have been, I think, if I were writing it today, it would be more sophisticated, perhaps more nuanced, certainly based on more documents, but I tried to strike a balance between Italian fascist responsibility for the horrors that had occurred and the Italian, the more positive side of Italian responses. I tried to strike that balance, and I'm more or less satisfied with what I wrote. Now that's not my point. My point is that when I lectured about my book to audiences all over the United States in the early 1990s, I generally tried to convey to my audiences what I had written in the book, which was, again, this balance, this delicate balance, if you will, between responsibility for the persecution and responsibility for some assistance to Jews in great distress after 1943. But the audiences that I had, invariably, there were 3 or 4 people who would stand up in the audience and say, we Italians had no responsibility for anything. And it was always astounding to me, because what I said was usually rather positive, particularly at the end. I would speak about the racial laws, and I would stress the fascist responsibility, the indigenous Italian responsibility, the fact that those laws were enforced despite what had been written, and this is, as I say, in the early 90s. But I would end with on a more positive note. The audience would just not hear it. They wanted no criticism whatsoever. Now this is in the early 1990s, and it's also in the United States. My questions for you and for Dr. Professor Schwarz would be, has this changed in the United States at all? And if it hasn't, what can we do to present, what more can we do to present a more complex interpretation? I would also, of course, like to know, and that would be my final question, and then I'll go back to earlier points, but my final question was, Professor Schwarz has not told us how this changed in Italy, when it changed, why it changed. I understand new documents, I understand the work of scholars like David Bidusa and also David Radogno, and the slow process by which these things changed, but I would also be interested in knowing the role of the Italian Jewish community in changing interpretations and the general receptivity of the Italian public to the newer interpretations. A little vignette that I thought I would share with you. When I was writing another book about, much more recently, about Jewish refugees from Central and Eastern Europe who had taken refuge first in France and then gone into a little town called Saint-Martin-Vésubie and then gone over the Alps into Italy when the Germans occupied southern France. And my book was based on the trying to spread more broadly an interpretation from a number of families who I interviewed. And these were survivors, so of course their stories were based on positive responses. That's why they survived. Obviously, one cannot generalize as to the broader experience of Jews in France or Italy, but one perhaps can understand from some testimony how individual people survive. So these survivors would tell me their experiences in France and their experiences in Italy. Invariably, there were people in France who had saved their lives. In August of 1942, when Vichy police first began to round up Jewish refugees in the unoccupied zone, Vichy police, someone in the bureaucracy warned them, these individuals, not everyone, that the raids were coming and they were able to escape, or someone hid them in a barn, or someone helped them on their way, gave them false papers. When they got into Italy, the stories were similar. How Italians had helped them, that's why they survived. But then, at the conclusion of the testimony and the conclusion of our interviews, they would usually say something like, you know, the French were terrible and the Italians were great. And I would say, but you know, because also there were the bad stories, you know, their uncle, their father was rounded up in France, they lost a sister, a mother in Italy. And I would say, well, you know, your stories are very similar in both countries. You had good experiences and bad experiences in both. Why are you making this general statement? And there was no explanation, and it's a phenomenon I still cannot understand. So I would like to make one brief point before I give up my post, which would be that the impact of the testimony of Jews in Italy, whether they were Jewish survivors in the most narrow sense, whether they were Jews who had been present but not arrested, or whether there were American chaplains coming in to Italy after the war. Those testimonies positive to the response of Italians have influenced the interpretation that we are discussing today. But it has also been extremely important and decisive for our understanding of Vatican responses. That, of course, is my own focus in my own work. but I have come across it over and over again. And the testimonies are generally extremely misinformed, erroneous, based on nothing except the misinformation or the ultimate objectives that Professor Schwarz has been discussing in a non-Vatican sense. So it is important in that sense as well that we deal with this phenomenon that Dr. Schwarz has presented. I have many questions, but I think it's only fair that I should let you ask yours. I had hoped when I was thinking about this presentation that we might be able to order our questions in some way, in the sense of making them chronological, perhaps dealing with the immediate post-war period first, and the 47, 48, 49, 50, 1950 years a little bit later. I'm not sure if I'll be able to manage that, but I think we should try to have overall coherence to our discussion if it's possible. And I will then ask some of my questions later. I think one general subject that we have not really discussed is how pervasive after the war were anti-Semitic perceptions within the broader population. What was the legacy of the fascist propaganda that Italians had been hearing since at least 1938, if not sooner? That's a broad and general question, but why don't I now let you respond?
Your narrative on the Zionist and the trend and also the apathy is very revealing. But I have a question. Isn't it true that there is a third trend that goes way back to the early fascist era? And let me summarize it as Giustizia e Libertà. And those were also the people that joined the partisans in the resistance and so forth. Didn't that, in some sense, morph into another trend, which you could call internationalist, goes way back in Italian and particularly Jewish philosophy? And without disparaging, didn't that also form sort of the roots of become part of the Italian Communist Party? Vittorio Foà being an example. And that too would seem to me to be a consequence of all of the chaos and all of the oppression of the Second World War. Can you comment on that?
Do you I probably
Do you want to collect some more?
no,
or
I think
question
that's
answer?
enough. I think that's
Okay.
enough for you.
Big enough
then
question.
and then we'll go on.
Okay. Yeah, you're certainly right. I mean, I did not mention, there's a whole series of things I didn't mention, but the presence of Jews within the anti-fascist movements of various political and ideological orientation, of course, was quite consistent. It was consistent before the racial laws and obviously even more afterwards. At the same time, I think it's important to remember always that we have a special situation in Italy. We have fascist Jews, which is something that we cannot have in other places in Europe, simply because they would not be accepted in those circles. And but yes, certainly that element played a role. If you look at the post-war political scene, Italian post-war political scene, which is of course dominated by the Christian Democrats, at the same time, it's a Christian Democrats which were, for obvious reasons, of course, with whom Jews would have difficulty to relate to. But at the same time, it was a political scene in which was the idea that the founding elements of the Republic were its anti-fascist nature. That element was the key element legitimating the presence of the very big Communist Party in Italy. And furthermore, you have a whole series of other minor, well, socialists were not minor at all, and then other minor formations which could gather Jewish vote and Jewish attention, and which allowed to feel part of the culture.
We're non-Zionist, if not anti-Zionist.
Well, they become anti-Zionist very late. If you look at the immediate post-war years, it's interesting to note that the socialists and the communists in Italy were very pro-Zionist, at least until the early 50s. Things start to change in 1956, and then even more in 1967. But and yet in 1967 you have a clear anti-Zionist stance from the communists, but a clear pro-Zionist stance from the socialists. You have Nenni, who is the historical leader of the Italian Socialist Party, who gives a speech in 1967 for the 6 Days War, which is amazingly pro-Zionist. So that was also that situation, and I did not mention it, but it's certainly a key element to allow the reintegration, that allows the reintegration, the feeling of being accepted. The fact that you could be Jewish, you could be in the left, and the two things would not be perceived as conflicting until much later. But then a whole different story begins. And I'll answer Susan Ducotti's questions. Yeah, how it changed. I believe that just as much as in the immediate post-war, the Jews had a role in the construction of the narrative concerning their faith, they also had a role in the 80s and 90s and so on in overturning that narrative. If you look at the people who have made the most relevant contributions to scholarship, they are Italian Jews, mostly of one generation, the generation that was born after the war, lived through the movements of the 60s, student movements of the 60s and 70s. And they gave a very relevant contribution. They come mostly from the left. Let's say not mostly, all of them come from the left. And they gave a very relevant contribution in changing the outlook on things. The first thing, basic thing they did was something very obvious and very basic that nobody had done until the late 80s. Go see the sources and see what happened, especially, for example, concerning the implementation of the fascist racial laws. For a long time, the narrative was these laws were not really implemented. Hey, but until the 80s, no one went to the archives to see what really happened. The first one who did research like that was Fabio Levi in the concerning the city of Turin, and he showed not only that they were implemented seriously, but often the prefect went further than what the laws required. Was probably trying to be a very enthusiastic supporter and to prove his loyalty, whatever, but it exactly proved the opposite of what the common narrative was. But this is obviously relevant, but behind this, at the background, to search for the motives that pushed people to do this research and to change the outlook on things, I think there is a key moment, a key event, that is 1982 and the Lebanon War. In Italy as well as elsewhere, during the Lebanon War, in 1982, you have a huge amount of debate, TVs and newspapers, concerning, well, first of all, Israel's responsibilities in Lebanon and so on. But the discourse rapidly shifts to the Holocaust, the legacy of the Holocaust, the nature of the Jews, their role in society. Are they truly faithful Italians, Frenchmen, or are they somehow more tied to Israel and its needs? And it's a huge debate, which raises questions, raises attention, and is connected to a whole set, wide-ranging episodes of anti-Semitism. The worst episode was a terrorist attack in the synagogue of Rome, which caused the death of one very, very small boy on October 9, 1982, but that was only the final point of a climate. Now, that terrorist attack was made by Palestinian terrorists tied to Abu Nidal, so it was not a local thing. But before and after that, you have a series of anti-Semitic incidents like throwing of Molotov bombs and other disruptive acts on buildings or attacks on individuals, which were made by either left-wing or extreme right-wing movements. Italian movements, not foreign. And to that you have a whole discussion, a campaign on the pages of the most important newspapers, raising issues on, for example, one key issue was, can we compare the Holocaust to what is happening in Lebanon? Is Beirut like Warsaw? Which, from a historical point of view, is absurd, but it raised attention to the issue. In the immediate following years, you see it very clearly. The publishing industry perceives a new interest. People had been stimulated. So books were published, translated, movies came in, and TV shows, debates. And this build-up and creates an interest, a potential, and especially within certain groups, within that generation of Italian Jewish intellectuals who were in their 20s and 30s, more or less, who belong to the left and who were shocked by left-wing anti-Zionist / anti-Semitic episode. This led many of them to interrogate themselves on, well, maybe there is anti-Semitism in Italy. Maybe we imagined an Italian people, an Italian tradition that is not really what it is. Maybe we should reconsider everything. The logical thing was to look back and to start studying that history again. And there was also another connection, which I think had a powerful impact. The Communist Party was in great difficulty in that phase, was facing an attack on anti-fascist narrative that came from the socialists, from Bettino Craxi, was trying to push aside the anti-fascist narrative that had been, as we said before, one of the founding elements of the political and cultural system. And in the late 80s and especially the early 90s, one issue that allows the communists to give new input to the anti-fascist myth is anti-racism. You have the beginning of immigration from Northern Africa and so on in Italy, and you have the beginning of episodes of xenophobia and racism, the development of the Northern League movement. So anti-racism becomes a key element, and you see it very clearly if you look at the pages of L'Unità in the early 90s, an element to give new life to the anti-fascist discourse. This again builds up and stimulates, the interest of the public and of the publishing houses and of funding institutions in, well, that key moment in racist Italian ideology, where it comes from. So that's...
Maybe we should follow Susan's suggestion and go chronologically. If you could elaborate a little bit how the founding of Israel in 1948 impacts the reintegration of Jewish Italian communities, and how it informed how Jews were relating to Italian society at large.
Well, if you look at the Italian Jewish institutions, were by then clearly dominated by, as I said before, pro-Zionist leadership, were of course very happy for the state, and they celebrated in Jewish schools. They had very public celebrations also. So one of them, very symbolic, in Rome under the Arch of Titus, which had been forbidden to Jews to go pass through the arch, because it was created to celebrate the Roman victory over, well, ancient Jewish, the ancient Jewish state, and the destruction of the temple. And now they marched again for the first time, following the chief rabbi of Rome under the arch, but through the back. I mean, not in the front, but in the back side. In any case, it's a whole symbolic thing. But if you look beyond the Jewish side, if you look at the main newspapers, there is a huge support, very, very strong. The only elements that are perplexed are the Catholics, for obvious reasons, but they do not, they're not very vocal about their perplexity. It's a more a closed circle thing. So Italian Jews could celebrate the birth of the State of Israel and celebrate it with Italians, not feel that it was something that had to be kept hidden, or something that could be embarrassing in some way. That was certainly a key element, especially even though you had varying degrees within the left. This is also due to the fact that you had key figures within the socialist and communist parties, which were Jews, which were sensible to these issues and views. So certainly that played a major role.
Two questions, you can answer one or both or neither. Chronologically, going back then to 38, at the introduction of the racial laws, I've read that there was very little public protest, very little public expression of public, none. Okay, do you think that was, I mean, how much was general anti-Semitism, how much was fear of any kind of counter-government expression of opinion, and well, I'm interested in your estimation of why that was the case.
Well, it's not a free regime where you can publicly express your views.
No, there were thugs and assassinations and political violence.
Yeah, but
on the part of the, is it possible to know in general how?
It's well, you have these set of documents which are more problematic sources, which are the reports by fascist informers of what they heard on the train, of what people were saying in the factories or in the schools or in the universities. These are tricky sources, because you never know if what the informers report is what the authorities want to hear, or what was really being said in these contexts. And lots of different things come out. One of the key things that come out is that people are afraid that they're not worried about the racial laws or the Jews or whatever. They're worried about becoming closer and closer to Germany, and the fact that war is coming. That's the main problem if you look at these sources, which I repeat are extremely problematic. Beyond that, no, look, I think that you had Jewish testimonies to say what happened. And I think that one of the best descriptions that made by Primo Levi, he said, from one day to the next, my schoolmates did not say hello anymore. Was it fear? Was it, I don't know. It's very difficult to say. It's not even very relevant. I mean, we're not into a democratic system in which our idea of consensus plays a role. The state took a racial turn, and that was it. That immediately changed the situation. There was no room for discussion at any level.
If I just ever join up to that, if you read, however, Rosetta Loy's beautiful sort of narrative of growing up and having Jewish friends, and then all of a sudden, right, the racial laws, and also this, you sort of get a sense of, first of all, the sort of general apathy of that society, but also of the fact that in a Catholic family, right, they sort of somehow did not disregard it, right? They did not pay much attention to that. I mean, in a Catholic culture, there is this kind of sort of basic anti-Semitism, right? I mean, la parola ebreo, right, which I remember growing up in Italy in the 50s and 60s, in a place where we did not know any Jew, but you had la parola ebreo still, right? Apropos the legacy of the fascists, but also probably the legacy of pre-fascism, right? So it's not...
In the South, they call them Judah.
Right, I mean, all these kind of
Okay.
sort of elements of the culture on which the racial law are superimposed, and that particular culture does not have many, let's say, antibodies, right, for that. Right.
No.
So there is a whole, I mean, it's a very complex thing to grasp how it happens and how is it that, again, there is so little reaction, but if you think about that, I mean, you can sort of explain it a bit, right? And then I was thinking about how also the stereotype of the lawless Italian plays into this, right? So in a situation in which there is an evil regime, right, the lawless Italia becomes good, right? It's some of those stereotypical traits that can be deployed, right, in this way. So you say, oh, we do not really obey the laws. Well, you're totally right. If you go and look at the archives, you see that there were lots of zealous, very zealous functionaries of the state, right, and all the propaganda apparatus that invented all sorts of ways to immediately, right, implement these things and going beyond. And then I was thinking also the role of the Catholic Church.
Can you all hear? Can you hear all right?
I mean, the Catholic
Just
Church.
a little bit, if you
The
can.
Catholic Church protested about something, right, which concerned the jurisdiction, its own jurisdictions about marriages, right. So something that there was a room for protest, right, and the Catholic Church did protest about the things that touch its own power, right. But because again of this kind of sort of, let's say, bland anti-Semitism, let's say, which in some cases were not so bland, but that permeated the culture. There was no reaction.
Perhaps it would
I
be
mean,
worth explaining what the protest was. Maybe
Yeah.
not everybody.
Yes.
No, you're perfectly right. The Catholic background weighs a lot on this, but I think more in general, the fact that there's no liberal tradition, there's no sensibility for civil rights in that society, or very little sensibility. So in the moment in which a group is identified and they're deprived of their rights, it does not strike people as something so absurd and terrible and inconceivable. After all, you must think that in 1938 you have a regime that was in power for several years now, who had deprived all Italians of their civil rights. That's a key element. And the church, yes, well, they protest, but it's they protest through diplomatic channels. It's not a voiced, very loud, very strong, very visible protest. And they protest basically on one thing, on the fact that racial laws forbid intermarriage between Jews and Aryans. And the church says, no, you can't do this, because if they convert, they're fine for us. That was the only issue.
But it's very
for the
big.
church.
Has been a traditional mechanism of acquiring souls. So
But even that, I
So-
suspect, was not, even that protest, which you can see in the pages of Osservatore Romano, for
Right. It
example,
was actually
and
expressed
obviously in
publicly.
the Acti Documenti Siège now, but at the time, I wonder whether even that position was particularly helpful.
No, but how many people read the Osservatore Romano?
Right. And apart from
Very,
reading
very
that,
few.
what information would anyone have had, even of that very limited
But
protest?
the same thing
Well,
applies, sorry, just a very quick footnote on this. When in 1931 there are retaliations of the fascist regime against the Catholic organizations like Fucci, the church doesn't say anything official. I mean, it's not that they didn't stand up for the Jews. They were silent even when their own groups were very violently attacked in universities and different parishes. So we know that they did diplomatic pressure, that the nuncio went to see the Minister of Interiors, but outside nothing transpired.
Well-
And it was a series of very violent attacks all over Italy. In what would be the central factory for the formation of the Catholic leadership. Nothing appeared.
I think this is in the background that the church had just had the biggest victory since 1870 with the latter attacks. I mean, they had entered a completely different dynamics of
Yes,
power.
but in 1931 was after the Lateran
Yes,
attack.
exactly.
So it was after these big
But
peace
this is in the
celebrated.
background of having, I mean, of having, beginning to work on a completely new position of the church within Italy, within the national entity. But I wanted to ask a question. I think that one of the biggest, most important, most impressive early parts of the research that was done in the 80s was documenting how the census was made, of the 1938 census was made. When you go and look at this, it was not easy to make to really make an account of how many Jews and who was Jewish in Italy. And when you go and see how the census was made and you look at the documents, you realize the massive participation of informers, from the prefect to the chief of police to every single policeman, and to a huge network of informers who had been part already of the political police. So maybe I think that saying a few things on how these documents were made available.
Well, the documents were available, so no one went to look for them. The person who looked at this thing in particular was Michele Sarfatti, who did the best thing on the census. The issue is the fascist regime at a certain point wants to know how many Jews are there in Italy, and especially, and this starts actually much earlier, since late 1936, Mussolini starts being worried how many Jews you have in the army, how many Jews you have in the diplomatic corps, and then the universities, all key sectors. And he's totally unsatisfied by the replies he has, because first reply he has is he asks to the army chiefs of staff, give us the Jewish officers in the army. And they take a list of Jewish last names, they compare it with a list of officers, and they just mark them down. But the result is ridiculous, because it looked like 1/3 of the officers of the Italian armies were Jews, because they had last names that were vaguely Jewish, and there is a document with this list. One of them was Maresciallo Graziani, who was a key figure in the Italian fascist army and later head of the Italian Social Republic army, not a Jew in any way. And you have a whole series of other figures, and you have a comment by Mussolini himself saying impossibile. So then the next step was to get yourself a database, some kind of data on who are the Jews, where are they, what they do. And the census was built up for that. And it's an interesting document because it starts from those who are inside Jewish communities, who are members of Jewish communities. Since 1930, you had to be obligatory, there was the obligatory inscription in a Jewish community. And so you have that list. And then you have a whole set of other people which are slowly included. Because the system works that they send a series of documents to the head of the family, the male head of the family typically, and saying, write down who you are, your profession, etc., who your parents were, who your grandparents were, who you married, who the parents of your wife and her grandparents. She has brothers and sisters, do you have children, are they married, and so on and so forth. And through this, they got to a wider set of people who, in many cases, were not Jewish. They had converted or were children of people who had converted. They were not inside Jewish communities, but through the census mechanism, with the documentation, each family, head of the family describing his wider family network, you gathered all this information.
Well, I have a question which actually relates to later years. On the one hand, you kind of respect your
Yes,
position.
well, it's probably time to.
Well, actually, two questions really, I suppose, but I think they're connected.
Again, if you can't hear, please
Yeah.
wave your hand.
Two questions. But actually, first I wanted to say I thought that was an extraordinarily lucid presentation. I don't want to read your book now, but I think it's the best account I've ever heard, actually, of how this sort of self-narrative, Jewish self-narrative about benign fascism became constructed and why. And in fact, the fact it was constructed in good faith. These people were not doing this in any devious way. It was simply their belief that was the case. So I thought that was really wonderful. The two questions really concerned how, I think the question Susan raised earlier on, how this narrative changes and why. And I think you started to answer that in relation to a new cohort of people born around the end of the war who then are on the left and challenge it. But I wanted to ask really firstly how this connects to other kinds of revision by historians of an understanding of fascism, a revision of the idea of a kind of divide between fascism and anti-fascism. So that's to do with a certain myth of the resistance as having created a hiatus in Italian history. And that I think starts to be challenged. It's very hard to say exactly when, but certainly I think from the mid-60s there's this critique of the idea of one, anti-fascism. Fascism is riven with splits between different, anti-fascism is riven with splits between different ideas of how Italy should be reconstructed. One challenges the idea of a sort of benign fascism, and that's one idea. And the other, I think, is the beginning of revisions of an understanding of colonial history, which seems to be tied up with this. And that's also starting really in the early to mid-60s, people like Angelo Del Bocca's work on violence of Italian colonial regimes. So kind of question one is really how, when this changes, how far is it sort of synchronized with a wider change among historians in thinking about fascism, anti-fascism, and about colonial past. And the second question is really to do with the fact you say things sort of change in the 90s or sometime. And I would say it seems to me they change really more among the community of historians than among common sense. You still find many Italians who will doggedly defend the idea of Italiana della gente. I met a woman in Ethiopia when I was working there in 2009 who denied that it was possible that the Graziani massacre would have happened, this murder of approximately 17 to 20,000 Ethiopian civilians in February 1937, and said this was probably just propaganda. But the second question is really sort of when this changes and why. I mean, one of the things that's curious to me is how in the sort of late 80s or around 1990 you still have foreign Jewish historians or non-academics pushing very hard the idea of Italy's benign reputation. Jonathan Steinberg's book, All or Nothing, which comes out in 1990, is a good example. But there's also the film by Joseph Rocklitz, which people might have seen, The Righteous Enemy, made in 1987. He's not a historian, but he documented this account, pushing very, very hard the idea of a kind of systematic efforts by Italians to rescue Jews in Yugoslavia, France, and in Greece. So, why this kind of revival of the very strong kind of myth, if you like, of a good fascism in the late 80s, early 90s, when, from within in Italy, this is starting to be systematically attacked by historians.
If possible, could you repeat the question?
I'll repeat the short versions. Okay, question one: how far does this sort of revision of thinking about the Italian policy towards the Jews tie into a wider revision of thinking about the resistance and about colonial history? And the second question is why, despite the sort of turn towards a more critical view of Italian complicity with anti-Semitism or Italian anti-Semitism under fascism, is there a kind of movement by some historians and non-historians to promote the good fascist narrative in the 1990s or around 1990?
It's obviously very, very, a very complex thing. I'd say obviously there are different levels. There's the academic level, there's a political level, the media level, and from the academic point of view, it's clear that, if you look at the historiographical Italian or international production of the fascism of the 30s, that comes very late. And a consistent development in that direction comes exactly in the late 70s, early 80s, and from then on. So that's, if you want, a banal observation, but that plays a role. I mean, the debate of the earlier decades was concentrated on the origins of fascism, on the early years. Research on the 30s came much later. Of course, there are various things that are tied together. The studies on colonial history, for example. There too you find, you mentioned the book. The book makes a battle for many, many years, saying, I have proof that the Italians used gas in the Ethiopian war. And the chiefs of staffs of the army deny the evidence, documentary evidence. And you have key journalists like Montanelli denying it till very, very late. So this is a different debate, but it's obviously connected to the same myth of the good Italian. Things kind of converge in the 80s. Then there is, I think there's a key element that is brought about by Renzo De Felice, who, I didn't mention him, but he's always obviously a key player in the political, cultural, academic sphere, certainly more on the academic, but from a certain moment on, he plays also a cultural/political battle. And, De Felice raises the issue of consensus to the regime, which is groundbreaking, which is shocking, which causes huge debates. Why? Because he says, look, it's not true that the true Italian spirit was that of anti-fascism. Italians were fascists. They supported the regime. That strikes directly the anti-fascist narrative. It impacts one of the founding elements of that narrative. At the same time, though, and this is quite peculiar, De Felice, who's the one that talks about consensus in a very energetic and convincing way, denies the consensus for the racial laws. He tends to downplay that element because he insists was through the 80s, on a comparison between fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, and the Jewish element becomes a key element for comparison to distinguish the two sides. So the things get mixed up. At a certain point, you have some kind of a paradox. You have in the late 80s, you have this journalistic debate on the pages of the Corriere della Sera with a famous interview by Giuliano Ferrara to Renzo De Felice, in which he says lots of things, and one of the things he says is the points is that the socialist leadership was at the moment trying to open up politically to the neo-fascists, to establish contacts and to open up. And one of the things that De Felice says, look, we do not need anti-fascism anymore because in Italy there wasn't anti-Semitism. And there he establishes a link that is allows from the other side to play the opposite game. Then if you say that there was anti-Semitism, you need anti-fascism. I know it's very complex. I was just trying to draw a few lines, but here you have a. And from a more general media point of view, the 80s are a moment, well, in general, not only in Italy, of course, in which the Holocaust is at center stage. Holocaust memory, in general, gains center stage, and other traditional narratives in France and elsewhere are in a crisis. The anti-fascist narrative is not in a crisis only in Italy; it's going through a crisis in general, and that certainly plays a key role. And well, how this impacts on. You said, well, many people still believe in the myth of the full Italian. It's true. But it's very difficult today to see newspaper articles by main newspapers or reviews that celebrate that. You may have that, but it's more of a popular niche thing. Or you have it in connection with here I touch a question that Susan raised before, with the Vatican, with the Church. You have the good Catholic, the good priest, the good Vatican hierarchy that saved the Jews. That segment is still very, very strong. But in general, if you look at the debates on the cultural pages of the newspapers, the discourse on the good Italian has crumbled since the 90s. There was a Professor Canali.
Mi scuso, faccio una domanda in italiano e spero sulla gentilezza. Io come un allievo di De Felice mi sento di intervenire un momentino per chiederti un paio di cose e per anche così in qualche modo evidenziare un paio di aspetti della vicenda che sta trattando. De Felice polemizzava, o meglio, Sarfatti polemizzava con De Felice su alcune cose che tu sai che nel dibattito ancora oggi non sono state tanto sciolte. Cioè c'è ancora tra i De Feliciani chi sostiene che le ipotesi di Sarfatti siano discutibili. Faccio l'esempio di Mario Toscano. Quindi è un dibattito che a mio avviso si è smorzato, ma che in qualche modo è nella pelle della storiografia italiana. Dico questo perché De Felice ha il merito di aver affrontato per primo la questione degli ebrei. Lui riuscì a vedere, perché fu la comunità ebraica di Roma che gli aprì le porte e lo fornì di una serie di documenti che fino a quel momento non erano stati mai esaminati. quindi De Felice scrisse la sua storia degli ebrei, per la prima volta la scrisse su documenti forniti dalla comunità ebraica di Roma. E non è che De Felice negasse l'antisemitismo precedente alle leggi razziali. De Felice, da storico di razza, da un grande storico, cercava di capire una serie di aspetti del fascismo regime precedente alle leggi razziali che in qualche modo contraddicevano le leggi successive. Uno dei tanti esempi è che Mussolini ha utilizzato ministri ebrei. Faccio l'esempio di Guido Jung. Vabbè, chiamiamolo non ebreo, diciamo. Vabbè.
Battezzato, comunicato, cresimato e sposato in chiesa.
Vabbè, siamo nel 32, e Guido Jung, diciamo, fu utilizzato tranquillamente, anche se c'era una pubblicistica che in qualche modo. I decisamente antirazzisti e antisemiti nel fascismo fino a metà degli anni 30 furono degli emarginati. Prendiamo il caso di Preziosi, prendiamo il caso di Farinacci. Non possiamo parlare di personaggi che stavano al centro della vita del regime fascista. Erano ascoltati, ma diciamo anche dalla massa del gruppo dirigente fascista erano tenuti in un certo senso alla larga. Quindi c'è un atteggiamento ambiguo nel regime fascista che poneva problemi, poneva interrogativi a De Felice, che individuava poi nell'alleanza con la Germania, individuava poi il momento in cui in maniera esplicita, diretta, Mussolini dette corpo, dette forma al suo antisemitismo. Ma tutto il periodo precedente, a livello di analisi storica, non era facile inquadrarlo, non era facile interpretarlo. Ora, io sono dell'opinione che c'era nell'ideologia fascista, c'erano elementi che poi si sono sviluppati, germi dell'antisemitismo. Però ritengo anche un'esagerazione, come avviene per alcuni seguaci di Salfatti, andare a trovare l'antisemitismo di Mussolini addirittura nel 1910, 11, 12, dove... Ecco, allora, a mio avviso c'è un equivoco di fondo che la storiografia italiana non ha sciolto del tutto e che ha affrontato, a mio avviso, per la prima volta mosse in maniera molto seria e che poi De Felice fece suo. È il problema dell'antisemitismo di base che c'era nella popolazione italiana, legata a un antisemitismo tradizionale che veniva dalla Chiesa, che veniva da una cultura della Chiesa decisamente nemica, e che aveva contribuito a diffondere quel tipo di antisemitismo. Ma poi c'è l'antisemitismo nuovo, politico, del Novecento, che diventa genocidio, che diventa la possibilità di liquidare scientificamente un popolo, che è un fatto nuovo rispetto a quel tipo di antisemitismo che c'era nell'Ottocento e come dire, in qualche modo abbiamo avuto delle derive gravissime, tragiche anche nel Novecento, di cui la Chiesa deve portare tutte le responsabilità. Però per uno storico che deve affrontare questo tema in maniera scientifica sui documenti, a mio avviso ancora oggi non è facile sciogliere il dilemma: ma il popolo italiano è stato antisemita in una maniera aperta, esplicita, e quindi da condannare in blocco, oppure c'è abbastanza commistione di due tipi di antisemitismo, di cui uno fortissimo che viene dalla Chiesa, ma a mio avviso non avrebbe portato, era l'antisemitismo tradizionale. Su questo si è poi innestato l'antisemitismo scientifico, quello che con scientificità ha perseguito la liquidazione di un popolo. Ecco, mi chiedo, a mio avviso la storiografia è in panne in questo, ha grosse difficoltà nella ricerca di queste cose. Un'ultima osservazione: la vicenda degli ebrei in Francia è molto interessante per capire anche in un gruppo dirigente come quello fascista capire bene che cosa circolasse, perché insomma qui siamo in piena guerra sulla Costa Azzurra del Terriccio, c'è la parte occupata dagli italiani e la parte occupata dai tedeschi. Gli ebrei che si riversano scappando dalla zona sotto il controllo tedesco si riversano di sci e poi vengono sulla Costa Azzurra, vanno dalla parte italiana, certamente, non vanno dalla parte tedesca, si riversano nella parte italiana. E tu sai che fino all'8 settembre ci fu un contenzioso tra i tedeschi che chiedevano la consegna di questi ebrei e gli italiani che non la davano, non li consegnavano. E questo dibattito, questa discussione arrivò fino ai vertici, arrivò fino a Mussolini, che in un certo senso esitava. Poi quando aveva quasi deciso interviene Bastianini che dice guarda che se glieli dai ai tedeschi fanno tutti una brutta fine. Quindi c'era nelle sfere fasciste anche grossa esitazione. Tutto questo ha toccato De Felice, nel senso lo ha portato a riflettere sulle caratteristiche, diciamo, del nostro antisemitismo, dell'antisemitismo italiano e di quello fascista, da un certo momento in poi.
I don't know if all of you
Have you all
can
noticed?
follow that.
No.
Do you,
Mi scuso.
and do you, we also, it seems to have shifted a bit back
Yeah.
to the war years rather than the post-war period, the discussion.
Could somebody summarize?
Can you summarize
I will try to summarize. Basically,
a little bit so that they
Yeah,
that-
to-
keep
to-
your
to
face turned this way.
two issues were raised. The first one concerns the role of Enzo De Felice and Italian historiography in recent years and the debates. Professor Canali wanted to remind that there are still various interpretations and several areas of discussion that are still open. And in particular, I think he stressed how it was difficult to see the origins, to trace back the origins of fascist anti-Semitism, because the fascist movement was not racial, dedicated to a racial campaign from the onset, as we all know, and also because there were instances like that of southern France that he mentioned in the end, in which the Jews were protected and saved by the Italian authorities. More or less. And I think that Enzo De Felice played a very, very important role. It's obvious that he played a very important role in Italian culture and historiography, and his contribution in this topic is fundamental. We must remember that he wrote the book on Jews under the fascist regime in 1960. Was published in 1961. He was 29 years old. In my book, I reconstructed how he came to do this job, and he came to do this job because the Union of Italian Jewish Communities was looking for someone to do this since several years. Actually, it was since at least the early 50s that they were looking for someone suitable. And at a certain point, through a whole series of contacts, they found De Felice, who at the time was a young, unemployed scholar. Nothing wrong with that, of course. And
Had he begun his work on Mussolini, his biographical work on Mussolini at that time?
Not yet. He begins it right afterwards. He had done another book on the 18th century, and he had done some scholarly research on Jews in Rome in the late modern period. In the 18th century, but he had not studied these issues, and nobody had. And when he wrote that book, well, you had Polyakov, you had Reitlinger, who were general histories of the Holocaust, but you did not have specific national studies of that depth and quality. And it was very, very difficult because you did not have decent histories of fascism at the time. His is the first scholarly research that offers a history of a fascist regime from the beginning until the end, even though through the lens of the Jewish side of the story. So it was a very, very important achievement, certainly. At the same time, considering the circumstances, he inevitably was influenced by the cultural climate of the time. There are, especially in the first edition, it is very clear, he is influenced by the Eichmann debate. He's writing the book while the Eichmann trial is taking place in Jerusalem. And you all know that during the Eichmann trial, the myth of the good Italian comes out very strongly. Actually, it's funny, but there is a testimony by an Italian woman who says in Jerusalem, in the trial, lots of people helped us. The testimony becomes translated into everybody helped us, which makes a difference. And it came back to Italy through the translation as everybody helped us. That testimony was also endorsed by Hannah Arendt, who also in her book on Eichmann stresses how Italians were good and so on and so forth. And Italian newspapers covering the Eichmann trial gave ample attention to those kinds of episodes. And De Felice could not avoid being influenced, especially in that first edition. What I think is the main problem in that first edition, and to a lesser extent in the following ones, because you have a 61 edition, one in 72, 88, and 93, which are all revised versions. The last one, the 88 one, is much revised versions. And there are two things that, looking at it from retrospectively, inevitably, appear to be not fully acceptable today from what we know. The fact that he insists on the idea that the laws were not fully implemented. And he does that even in the 1993 edition, which does not fit into what we knew by 1993. The second issue, which is much more evident in the earlier editions, concerns what happened between 1943 and 1945, in which he puts a lot of evidence on the people who saved Jews, which is, of course, there were lots of people who saved Jews, no doubt. But he uses one peculiar source, and he uses that source, and there's a 4-line citation from the 61 edition up to the 1993 edition. And then it's a citation from a speech given by the president of Italian Union of Jewish Communities in 1956, in which he says, all Italians were good, all Italians helped us. And he uses that to summarize what happened between 1943 and 1945. I understand it in the first edition, which was sponsored by the Italian Union of Jewish Communities, the fact that the victims say that there were no perpetrators, basically, is obviously something that the historian has to take into account. That works for 61. For the following editions, a lot less. It's a lot less justifiable. I agree with you that I think that the best part of the book of De Felice is on the part preceding 1938. It's on the fact that it is difficult to trace clearly the origins. It's not one red line that leads to 1938. And sometimes in the other side of the debate, that line of continuity has been stressed too much, certainly. And one final word for southern France. Yes, the Italian authorities in the Italian press refused in several instances to hand the Jews to the Germans. They do it because they were good. I don't think that's an element for historical analysis. They did it because they had a different policy, because they were an autonomous power that did not want to give up its sovereignty over that territory and its people. That's the main issue.
I would like to bring a different perspective that no one's thinking about. It's a comparative analysis, and I just want to mention it, maybe you want to think about it. In 1942, Japanese Americans and Japanese Canadians were perceived to be a threat to the state. The state said, we're going to round them up, take them in railroad cars and put them in internment camps. The population of North America thought they were civilized countries. They cooperated with putting the Japanese and Canadian Americans onto the railroad cars and off to the internment camps. Nobody was hiding or protecting the Japanese Americans or the Japanese Canadians. And these were internment camps. They were not death camps. And you know what happened after that. Is it possible that Italians or French or even Germans believed in the 1940s that Italy, well, late 30s, early 40s, that Europe was a civilized country and that people were being shipped out to internment camps? They might have believed their government. Just a thought from a different perspective, because the what?
In 1938, I was expelled from the schools, from the Italian schools. What about my civil rights? Human rights.
No, Japanese Americans were just expelled from their homes and shipped out. I'm just commenting that in America, I'm trying to look at the psychology. In America, the population totally cooperated with the Japanese being moved out of their homes and shipped off to internment camps. No one's looked at this, but I'm not saying, and I'm just, you looked at the, and ditto in Canada. So could it be that some of the population, the less sophisticated part, actually believed what their government said in France or Italy? They believed it in America and Canada, and they just cooperated with the shipping, the moving of their neighbors into internment camps. I just bring it up as a different perspective.
It's very hard to compare these things, but yeah, I think that many probably believe their governments, and their governments were using very powerful instruments to transmit their vision of things. But
So I'm sorry I missed your response to this business, but
Please
just-
speak so that
oh,
they
yeah.
can hear you.
I was just saying I missed the response of Susan Scotti. So forgive me if my comment has already been, articulated. But it just strikes me when we speak of going. It's so useful to go back to the original context of De Felice's early, research, and then how it was a 1993 edition, and how slow the climate of changes in terms of accepting things that need to be said but people are not ready to hear. So in thinking about this brave new work, which now can be received in a better climate of speaking about how there were Italian Jews partly collaborated in the elaboration of this kind of national narratives because it was painful, because of this book which may have been mentioned, Casa, which I discovered, which was so useful of talking about how this it's very sad, bittersweet desire to go back into the community and have everything be okay, and the price for that psychologically was dismissing, which is the working of trauma also, but as it happens on a collective level. So these are very difficult issues to talk about, and if you think about how you have this let's say, internal factor of the community that was a victim not being ready for some time to think about it, then Italian, public in general did not want to hear about the context, which was fascism. And many of you know when my book was published in 2000, it had a horrible reception in the Italian press, and there were weird things. I will say to this community, there were strange things among those bad reviews about me talking too much about Jews, because my name looks Israeli. And there was one reviewer who said I taught at Yeshiva University. I had no affiliation ever with Yeshiva. So there was a lot of unconscious, strange things, because here was someone who came from outside. And the book had some things about Jews, but it was hardly about Jews. So that's just an example, and this was in 2000. And so you think about that, and then going back further, how this whole international context for wanting to sweep the Cold War, has been studied by so many people, not wanting to have a true process of reckoning with the past. And so, these are things happening at very different moments, but, your book is so valuable, and I did a full disclosure, I did a blurb for it, right? Because I believe it's this, sign of the best of this new research, and it's very exciting. It's like fitting that we're having this seminar now, because I feel like it's a new phase of research that is starting, building on all the fantastic things done before. But so I thank you also for saying these things. To now happily to public, an Anglophone public as well as Italian public. I don't have a question. I just want to praise you.
Okay. Yes. All right. Sorry. And then we'll work done.
Do you see the Sarfati book as being a corrective?
Loudly.
Sarfati's book as being a corrective in any way to De Felice?
It's two very, very different approaches. No, I wouldn't say that. I think, personally, I think we still need to go another step forward. Sarfati insists a lot on the idea that the racial legislation derives from the Mussolini's belief that Jews cannot be fully turned into part of the nation and of the fascist culture, that the fascist new men, Jews do not fit into the... And he insists on that and describes the whole internal dynamics of the battles between the fascist and the not so fascist Jews in the Italian communities, which may be an element. At the same time, I think what he lacks still is the cultural, intellectual side of the story. I think we need, hopefully someone will do it, but a history that will be able to put together the intellectual history of racism, prejudice, and so on, and the history of the legislation, the history of the relationship between the Jewish group and the power structures within the regime, and put them all together. From a certain point of view, Sarfati introduces a whole set of new elements, but which is unavoidable considering the time since the past and the research that had happened since the Felice's work. But yeah, I think there's still a lot to be done. It's a completely different outlook. It's a lot more focused on the Jewish side and a lot less on the regime and how it worked and so on. I also told him what I think that really is missing in that book is the whole side of cultural roots of Italian racism and fascism and the role of propaganda. That's something that still has to be fit into the whole picture.
So a few studies came out on Preziosi that
yes, but
pretty illuminate. I think that one thing that is happening, and we've been trying to bring historians of the new generation who explore on a strong documentary base, like Radogno or Casata, the the system, the fascist system. How did it work? How did it work at the educational level or the propaganda level? And there is a lot of need for more research on that.
If I'm not mistaken, your personal background is your father was in the camp of Ferramonti.
My grandfather.
Your grandfather. Can you speak to that and what you learned from that and what happened that your grandfather and then your father was born and how that happened?
Yeah, well, my grandfather from my father's side, it's not a very special story. He was a Polish Jew who had come to Italy in the early 30s to study because there was a numerus clausus in Poland. So he came to study medicine and
Where did he go to study medicine?
Pisa.
Pisa.
And then he moved to Pavia at a certain moment, I don't remember when. And when the racial laws began and then there was the war, he, in 1939, with a group of Polish students, he went to the Polish consulate in Milan, saying, we want to go and defend our homeland. How can we go in Poland and fight? And the consul told them, look, boys, don't worry, things will be over soon, just go home. And right the minute they left the consulate, they were arrested by fascist police, took in San Vittore prison, and he was identified with some of the others as also being a Jew, so he was later sent to Ferramonti again. And later on he was moved to another camp that was in Campania, and later on to what was called it's a terrible formula, which is because it's paradoxical, internamento libero, free internal, but which meant that people were not in camps, but they were at a forced residence in
What town?
a small town.
What town?
Near Lago di Garda, a very small town, I don't remember the name. And from there in October 43, late September, he got a bicycle and went into Switzerland.
What does he, my family is from Campania. What did he say about Campania, do you know?
My grandfather died when I was 9, so we did not discuss about that very much.
Didn't know. My grandmother died only a few years ago, and she, she's 95, so you might have had him for a long time.
Any, yes?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to
His grandfather was on
maybe push the question of colonialism was raised before, and so racism in connection with colonial subjects. And I was thinking about you could reflect also on the post-war period, the interaction also between this construction of the goodness of the narrative of the good Italian in relation to the Jewish community, how that also accounts to the cause of the Italians trying to keep their colonies, at least the not Ethiopia, of course, but the others, right? So was that also, did you see also in your
yes.
Right, investigations in the archives, something to that effect?
There is a lot on that. It's funny, there's...
I'm sorry, could we please not talk? It's just a seminar, you can go outside.
There's actually a lot concerning that in the papers of both of the Italian Jewish communities and the Foreign Ministry, and the World Jewish Congress too. The first instance in which it comes out is 1945, when there is a delegate of the World Jewish Congress that goes to Rome and he meets with Italian Jews and he says, so what are your requests? What can we do for you? And the thing they say is that we want to make sure that Libya stays under Italian control. And the guy is shocked. What do you mean? Is that the only thing you care about? And the answer is, well, yeah, well, you can understand that because the Union of Italian Jewish Communities was responsible for the Jewish communities in Libya from, according to legislation. And the person he was talking to was Raffaele Cantoni, who had been a nationalist, he had been in Fiume, he was very patriotic. So you have this side, and you also have probably another side of the story. He was telling them what the Italian authorities wanted him to tell them. And you must remember that according to the law of 1930, that was in place until 1987, the Union of Italian Jewish Communities is basically a body of the state and has to report directly to the Ministry of Interior, so they did not have full autonomy. Furthermore, if you consider that they had to relate to the government for the reintegration purposes and the laws and so on, it would be hard to ask for things to the Italian government while at the same time you're not cooperating. So you have this kind of and you have those requests. It's very clear from the point of view of the Italian Foreign Ministry that their what they call the Jewish card, they call it very explicitly the Jewish card, can help to keep the colonies. It doesn't work, of course, but
I think we've come around back to the issue of the Jewish community itself. I mean, the official organized post-war Jewish community, and we have not had a chance, time has run out, I think, but we have not had a chance to ask you all of the questions that we might like to know. We will read your book. I wonder, for example, the role of the Union of Jewish Communities in terms of dealing with refugees, and the kind of organized assistance that there was, the kind of welcoming. You referred to it a bit in your remarks about how this was compatible with the wishes of the government, but I would have liked to have heard more about the community. It's the Union of Jewish Communities and the refugee questions. I'd also like to know whether there was a perception within the Jewish community of war criminals who were going through Italy. Was there an awareness of that? Was there awareness that former German soldiers, if not war criminals, were coming through Italy and going out? And was there a position taken by the Union of Jewish Communities? Also, the question of the purges of collaboration. Did the Union of Jewish Communities take up an official position? I understand how difficult there and nuanced and complex the situation was, and also the priorities. But these are issues that must have come up at least. I hope you've all had a chance to ask your questions. I'm afraid that time has run out, and so you don't have to answer mine either, but these are perhaps questions that we can reflect upon.
No, perhaps.
Thank you.
I think the position of the union.
I thought it might be a fitting way to
Maybe like a
end,
good
to tie your remarks.
You want me to?
Yeah.
I can respond.
Okay.
Close with this.
Do you want, can we give Professor Schwarz just 2 or 3 more minutes?
1 minute is enough. It's very, very quickly. Yes, they did their best to support the refugees that were going to the country, but they had no means, they had no resources.
Yeah.
Those that had the resources were the people of the Joint, the American Joint Distribution Committee. They were, and the UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Agency, they were the ones actually materially supporting the refugees. What the Union of Italian Jewish Community did was to play a role of intermediation with the Italian political authorities, from intermediation for the Zionists, intermediation for the American Joint, and so on and so forth. Regarding war criminals, I found nothing about that. They seem not to be in any way aware that German war criminals are going to the country. Regarding the
Trials of collaborators.
Trials of collaborators.
Were there?
You have trials in the early months of the liberation, and then most of these are followed by other trials that last for several years. But you must, there's a key thing that must be said. Selling a Jew between 1943 and 1945 for a small 5.000 lire, it was compensation you get from the Germans or from the fascists, was not considered a crime in post-war Italy. So there were no trials that were concerned specifically with that side of the story. You had trials for collaborators to the fascist system in general in various, but not for giving over Jews to deportation. So this makes the role of the Italian Jewish community much more complicated. They intervene in some key debates, for example, one concerning Nicola Pende, which was a key intellectual in the Italian scientist and key figures of Italian racism. And they intervene with great force against Pende, who is acquitted actually, nonetheless, and who keeps his position in the university. Like all the rest, you must consider that, as far as I know, no key figure in the anti-Semitic racial system built up after 1938 was in any way meaningfully punished after the war. The professors who signed the racial manifesto kept their posts. The figures in the Italian Interior Ministry who organized and implemented the laws kept their positions and were promoted through the years. So yeah, well, they take position in a few very public instances, but with no effect. It was very hard for them to take public positions in political issues. For example, when during the early 50s there's a discussion about the rearmament of West Germany, they are in huge embarrassment because from one side they don't want it, and they are pushed by youth movements who go to the streets with the left and the communists to protest against it. On the other side, they are terribly afraid to take a position that is the position of the Communist Party, that of course doesn't want the rearmament of West Germany, so they decide not to take a stand. They're in a very difficult position.
Well, thank you very much.